My name is Melisa Brittain, and I'm the research associate for FNCARES. I'm a settler, scholar, and filmmaker currently living on Treaty 6 territory in Amiskwaciwâskahikan, Beaver Hills House, Edmonton, Alberta. FNCARES is a partnership between the University of Alberta and the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Alberta, the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada, and the University of Alberta's Faculty of Education. So at FNCARES, we research and educate about the structural drivers of disadvantage for First Nations children, youth, and families. And we work with the Caring Society to develop community-based solutions to ongoing discrimination and inequities. And with community partners, we organize and host public events each year. Thanks to Shane Klein, Technologies and Education, University of Alberta, for all the tech support for today's presentation, and to the U of A in general for its amazing support of FNCARES and our work with the Caring Society. Thanks also to Desiree Kane. She's a Miwok journalist and communications professional, and she's assisting Stephen Hassan today with adapting his model of mind control, authoritarian control to the Indigenous world. He'll tell you a bit more about that as we go along. And we're really happy to have you here all today to explore the connections between mind control and colonization. So please note that the talk's not going to be about anything about conspiracy theories. It's about how minds are controlled as a matter of course. So how the ideology of colonialism is normalized, how it impacts how we think and how we act. So that's what we're addressing today in relation to Dr. Stephen Hassan's model of mind control. We've posted the event hashtag in the chat box, or I'm about to do that, so you can tag us if you post. Outline of the program today is first of all, the participants will not be able to turn on their microphones during the event. We're going to be asking you to submit your questions for the speakers through the chat box, and we'll have the Q&A session after the three speakers have talked. We have three wonderful speakers here to talk about the concept of mind control and how it relates to ongoing colonialism in Canada. Each speaker is going to present for around 20 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A session afterwards, and we hope you'll all join us for that as well. So the order today is going to be Dr. Cindy Blackstock first, Dr. Stephen Hassan second, and then Dr. Pam Palmeter is going to be presenting. And we're very excited to have all these speakers here today, and we thank you so much for coming. So just to introduce Dr. Blackstock, Cindy Blackstock's a member of the Gitxsan First Nation and is honored to serve as the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society. And she's also a professor at McGill University's School of Social Work. She has over 30 years of experience working in child welfare and Indigenous children's rights. And she's published more than 75 articles on topics relating to reconciliation, Indigenous theory, First Nations child welfare, and human rights. It's very hard to cut down Cindy's bio, but that's all I'm going to say for now. Welcome, Cindy.
Thank you very much, Melisa. And I am so honored to join you from unceded Algonquin territory here in Ottawa, and to actually be able to kind of surface these ideas with you. Because honestly, I'm here for answers as much as I am hopefully going to share something maybe of value to you. I cannot figure out why the Department of Indian Affairs and the Government of Canada doesn't do better when it knows better. Why have we always provided all these solutions, identifying the injustices, providing ground up solutions to address them, and it goes nowhere? Like, that is the major, major frustration I face every day. And honestly, it was just recently, some of you'll remember, after the affirmation of the survivor's truce, and I use that phrase deliberately instead of stories, because I think stories can often mean it's a mythology. But the survivors told us that there were children in these unmarked graves, but no one really listened to them. But after it was kind of brought to media attention, I saw Prime Minister Trudeau rise in the House of Commons as I'm preparing to go to court against the Canadian government to try and protect the compensation order and to make sure First Nations kids off reserve get help under Jordan's principle. And he rose in the House of Commons, and I'm literally in my living room, and he says, "We are not fighting Indigenous kids in court." And I thought, what? Where is this coming from? How can you say this? Like, you could just, we're going to federal court next week. I didn't understand where all this stuff is coming from and why so often the government is kind of portraying itself almost as the victim. That the problem isn't that it's not treating First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples with justice. The problem is that we don't appreciate all the good work that they're doing for us. So this is kind of plugging into a journey where I was on the Lincoln Project. And I was watching or listening to this great podcast, and Stephen Hassan popped up on the podcast talking about the whole concept of mind control. And I thought to myself that I've always understood that mind control or propaganda was always part of colonialism, and that shaped the non-Indigenous population's view of us, and it shaped the government's messaging and really helped create the climate where these injustices would happen. I was also really alive to the fact that we weren't immune from those effects. That too often we have formed a relationship with Canada that really reinforces that. And I'm part of the problem. So I wanted to understand this more deeply. And when I heard about this whole thing about mind control, I thought I have to learn more. So let me tell you how I got to that journey. And then Stephen is going to take it over from there. And then the amazing Pam Palmeter, who is just has been rightfully acknowledged as one of the most amazing women in Toronto this year, will show us how this really manifests across a large area of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit rights. So what I've really come to realize is there's so many myths about the country. One is that, oh, people back then didn't know about what was happening in these residential schools, or they didn't really appreciate that the murder and missing Indigenous women and girls were going missing. That was a different standard of that time. People have changed now. And what is really clear to me is that the harms are always in plain sight, and they're actually in plain sight now. It's not a question that these things were hidden. The other is that the government chooses not to implement the solution. It's not a failure. They deliberately, they think about it. They apply their skills and they make a choice not to do it. The other thing that's clear to me is we haven't learned from history. Certainly the government hasn't. And we know that because Canada is a repeat offender, first from residential schools, the apology, the compensation, then the 60s scoop, the apology, then compensation, and now the harms to children today. Like this, all this behavior keeps on going. But I also don't think that we've sat back in sufficient time to really look at what our behaviors have been in response to them, right? The discrimination has been normalized and made benevolent. And our patterns continue to perpetuate that piece. And that's the piece I'm trying to unplug. How am I part of the problem? So here is my situation, but we all, you know, some of you may be working on lands and resources matters or murder of missing Indigenous women. You'll find different parallels to this, right? But here is the pattern that I talked about, where we have to break this somehow. And even if the government of Canada doesn't change its behavior, we have to change our behavior so that we're not reinforcing it time and time again, and leading to yet another generation of First Nations kids who are going to be hurt, right? Because that work has yet to seriously be done. We've done some piecemeal stuff with the tribunal, which has been absolutely essential. Do not want to underplay that at all. But have we gotten to the place where we can ensure that Canada won't hurt another generation of kids? The answer to that is no, we haven't. And one of the signs that I look for is the government of Canada, even in the wake of this behavior pattern, is talking about reforming everybody else except for itself, the wrongdoer, right? We're the problem, not them, right? So here's the guy that started the ball rolling. And many of you know that I've spent a lot of time thinking about Dr. Bryce. But it is because I think that if someone would have listened to him back in 1907, we wouldn't have had so many people hurt over the years, right? here is a guy who's a non-Indigenous person, who's a government official, who is top of his profession, president of the American Public Health Association. You can't get much higher than that. And he is raising the alarm about the needless deaths in the school. He's saying it's owing to the unequal public services, to quote Indians back then, and terrible health practices. It's not that the government of Canada disagreed with him. In fact, they agreed that the kids were dying and they agreed that they were underfunding. It's just that they chose to allow it to happen. And we know that because Duncan Campbell Scott, the official on the other side of Bryce saying no, actually writes a letter in 1910 where he says, you know, it's well known that children are dying in the schools at far higher levels than in their villages. But this alone does not justify a change in the policy of this department, which is geared towards the final solution of the Indian problem. That's 1910. So from this quote, we get clearly he knew the kids were dying. He knew that they were dying because they're in these residential schools. But, oh, well, that's just part of the bigger agenda, right? So I think about, you know, you already know, and as public information, I'm not letting any secrets out, that the compensation alone for all the kids that Canada's hurt in our case is going to be billions and billions of dollars. If Canada would have spent the $10,000 to $15,000 to remedy the inequalities and kept that going, that's how much it would have cost back then. Doing the right thing is actually cheaper. So even on an economic sense, what Canada is doing doesn't have any economic basis. So there's no scientific basis, there's no economic basis. And I've spent so much of my time thinking that they're actually moral and rational and they respond to evidence. And that was a flaw. The evidence is essential to holding us accountable to communities to make sure we're doing the right thing, but it does not work with government on its own. And here's I can just show, I'm just going to go quickly through these because I want you to have much more time with Pam and with Stephen. But here is the 1923. We can look at the national crime, which says that now Dr. Bryce is laying out all of his correspondence to Prime Minister Laurier and others to try and save these kids' lives. This thing is published, it's in the newspapers, and he's absolutely sure that if he tells the public about this, that they're going to rise up. But as Stephen is going to let us know, they're not going to rise up in sufficient numbers because they've been subject to this whole propaganda, mind control, colonialism thing too. And here's the result of that whole kind of mind control, as I would understand it in colonialism, is these children died. These are actually children who would have been saved had Dr. Bryce's report been implemented. And so this is so essential, right? And we all know the heartbreaking reality that this is echoed in so many other aspects of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit rights. So what about the professions like mine that are supposed to be alert to social justice, whereas that's what we're all about? Well, I found these minutes from the AGM of the Canadian Association of Social Workers from 1939. Now, 1939, of course, is an important year in Canada, even in the non-Indigenous. There's the start of the Second World War. It was the turning back of the St. Louis with all the Jewish refugees, where Canada returned back to face the horrors of the Holocaust. There were so many social justice issues. We had residential schools percolating, but these are the top priorities for the people in my profession. And you could see this along with other types of professions. So the professions themselves have also taken on board this kind of indoctrination. And here's my social work group again. We pop up in the 40s, and now we are saying something about residential schools, but yeah, they're not that great, but they need to operate. And assimilation is probably a good thing, but they do pick up on Dr. Bryce's point about the inequalities. They say that there's not enough in the Indian family to support homes or to support the kids being at home. So this is actually 1946. We're talking about, well, you can turn on your TV and see government officials saying we need to shift towards prevention. Well, that isn't a new concept. That was, you know, that is 80 years ago they were making that recommendation. Here's 1967, shows up again. Another social worker goes off, looks at the kids in residential schools, find 80% of them are placed there for child welfare reasons. This is something I'd really star for those of you looking at the 60s scoop. I think it's unfortunately too often missed, is that residential schools were also being used as child welfare placements during that time, between particularly the 50s through up until the 1996 closure. And here we have, again, Caldwell picking up on the Dr. Bryce's recommendation, the social worker's recommendation. Let's put more energy into providing supports in the Indian family. Then I enter this stream. And what I didn't do, one of my many mistakes, I greenhorn, total greenhorn, and I got sucked into. I thought, okay, we're going to show the government how unequally it funds First Nations child welfare. And we're going to work with the amazing First Nations experts all over the country to develop a solution. We did that in 2000. Government agreed it was underfunding by 30%. And that does not take into account the higher need due to residential schools. But Canada did what it always does. Nice report. Thanks for writing it. We need a more detailed report. So I got sucked right in there again. We did the more detailed report. By then, of course, on the ground, the inequalities had grown for children. It was only after they didn't implement this that finally the light bulb goes off, and I realized that negotiation and reports and evidence are not going to resolve this on its own, that we have to move outside of that into litigation. And when you're looking at the credibility, because sometimes they say, well, that report wasn't good enough, you need a more credible one. We turned to the Auditor General a year after we filed that report. The Auditor General was then Sheila Fraser. It's hard to find a more credible person in Ottawa than her. And she says they're still messing up, and they did exactly the same thing to her. Yes, we like the recommendations, and we're reviewing them, and then they don't do anything, right? So just to show, this is the pattern that I have seen over the years on child welfare. Now, when I was I'm a collector of old papers, and I'm definitely not a historian, but I love old stuff. So this is one of the papers that was produced by a guy named Jerry Gamble. And he was a former Indian Affairs employee. And he was fired from his position because he was working too closely with the local First Nations. He presents what he sees as Canada's strategies for stealing human rights at a human rights conference at Topic First Nation in New Brunswick. And you can see some of these patterns are very familiar to us today. Convince the Indian he should be patient. The be patient speech, the one commonality of that is it's always given by those who don't have to be patient, who can turn on their tap and get clean water, whose kids aren't getting less because they're First Nations. It's like, we can't change things overnight. We're making good progress. We've done more than every other government. That's how that manifests. Make sure that things are being done for his own good. You're going to come to really appreciate all the good stuff that we are offering you. You just haven't really given it a chance. It's often also comes in a package of, you don't trust us, right? And I flipped that around in my own head now. I said, you don't act in trustworthy ways. The problem isn't that I don't trust you. The problem is that you don't act in trustworthy ways. Insist the Indian go through proper channels. How many times have we spent at negotiating tables on our rights, on self-determination? We're negotiating self-determination with governments. Why? If we're self-determining, right? Make the Indian believe you're working hard for him. Like, this is all look at all the stuff we've done for you. You don't appreciate what we've already done. I get a lot of these people on Twitter. I don't know, Pam, if you do too. You always talk about what they haven't done. You don't appreciate the good stuff that they've done, even when they're still actively discriminating against our kids. So these are some of the signs of it. And I think that one of the real key pieces where this has potential, not as the only thing that we need to understand about colonialism, but as part of it, is it'll allow true self-determination. It'll allow us to ask ourselves questions, to really set ourselves free and be self-determining. To me, self-determination is when we declare ourselves free in our own minds. That's where it begins. Because what this mind control does is it makes you feel that your world and your opportunities are fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer. You'll get like, we can't take Canada on that because what if they cut our funding? We can't deal with this particular issue because we'll negotiate that or we'll throw up a roadblock, but we don't have any other options other than that. And I think that we have to do our part in questioning our behavior and disrupting those relationships. And we need to put our resources where they're going to make a difference. Instead of writing more reports or inquests, let's actually put the resources, the scarce resources we have, for the greatest impact going forward. So what happens for me when I get self-determining is I start to really look at those differences and reclaim that ontology that's closer to the worldview I grew up with. So I start to do things like this and really talk about what some of the general differences are as I understand them between First Nations and others. And I use this for a theoretical paradigm. I'm not going to go into this in detail, that's another day, but I wanted to say that this was very important and liberating work because I would use words like balance. But honestly, if I'm really honest with you, I didn't think deeply about what that meant. What does it look like if something's in balance? What are we putting in balance? Over what time period are we putting stuff in balance? What do we say when we talk about ancestral knowledge? It's very different, like in a Western setting. We believe our ancestors are mostly right about the most important things, the relationship to ourselves, to each other, to the land. And Western society thinks that that's not true, that the best knowledge is what we produce today and coming around the corner, right? And you see that in academia all the time. Those of us who are in academia get sucked into this stuff. And it's understandable because that's a modus operandi, but we need to pause and ask important questions. So I'm going to end it there because I want you all to hear what I heard on that Lincoln project. And to say a huge thanks to Stephen and to Desiree for their great work in bringing this to us.
Thank you so much, Cindy. That's a great opening for hearing Stephen's talk. Doctor, I'll just introduce you before we get started. Dr. Stephen Hassan is an internationally recognized expert on cults, brainwashing, and authoritarian control. He is also a licensed mental health a licensed mental health professional and founder of the Freedom of Mind Resource Center. We'll provide a link, Desiree already has, which provides training, consulting, and support to individuals who are struggling to leave or recover from a cult and to families and organizations that are concerned about cult behaviors. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you so much. Amazing, Cindy. I'm honored, and Pam, to be included in this talk today. And I have 20 minutes, so I'm going to talk fast, but the slides will be up on your website, and I have a lot on my now I have two things that I need to choose which one is which. After, excuse me, share, nervous. So let's move forward quickly. So what I'm going to talk about is what is mind control and how does it relate to colonialism, and what do people need to know to disrupt colonial thought control patterns. And I want to just do a shout out to Miwok journalist and professional communicator, Desiree Kane, who is here with us today, who put this together, which is an amazing slide presentation. So these are some of my key books, and I'll just speed forward. But Pam, I know you're an attorney, and my big lift before I die is I want to change the law to include undue influence and make it a crime to enslave other human beings around the world. I get emotional sometimes, so forgive me. How did I come to this weird profession of being an expert on cults? Well, I was 19 years old in 1974, February, when Same month Patty Hearst got kidnapped by the Symbionese Liberation Army, I was deceptively recruited into a front of a right-wing fascist cult called the Moonies. And Moon claimed to be the Messiah and said that democracy was satanic and Korea was the God's chosen nation. And I literally became a Manchurian candidate where I was trained to die on command or kill on command for the group to save the world. And there's many talks that I've done. I only have 20 minutes. But I wanted to show the mass weddings. He once married 30,000 members at one time, and he would line up the men and women and go, you and you, you and you. And because people believed he was the Messiah and could read their spirits, they accepted his choices. And many of these people didn't speak the same language, have the same cultures. And now years later, most of them have failed. The guy in the upper right is Sean Moon, who's at war with Mother Moon, the woman in the left, upper left image. I wonder if I can use my arrow. She's now running the show, and Donald Trump spoke for a virtual conference along with Pence and a bunch of other officials from the Trump cult. But this guy has a brother who makes guns, specifically assault rifles and pistols. And he was at January 6th doing disinformation about Antifa. And the Moonies paper, the Washington Times, said, oh, it was Antifa that was invading the Capitol. Back to this topic. That's my background. When I was deprogrammed from the cult after a near fatal van crash, I wanted to understand what happened to me. What turned me against my tradition, my family, my friends, my college, my poetry. And so I learned everything I could about brainwashing and mind control. And here I've been invited to apply my work to this international problem, and of course, specifically for First Nations. So I guess, shall I read this? I'll do it quickly. It's like there's this predator energy on this planet, and this predator energy feeds upon the essence of the spirit, feeds upon the essence of the human being, the spirit. This predator energy can take fossil fuel and other resources out of the earth, turn it into a fuel to run a machine system. But in order for there to be a need for that system, and in order for that system to work, they have to mine our minds to get at the essence of our spirit. In the same way the external mining takes place, it pollutes. We see now people understand how it poisons the environment, the water, the air pollution, the mining of the essence, the mining of our spirit, the mining of our minds. The pollution from that is all the neurotic, distorted, insecure behavior patterns that we develop. That's the pollution. Because in order for this predatory system, this disease to work, we must not be able to use our minds in a clear, coherent manner. Because if we use our minds in a clear, coherent manner, we will not accept the unacceptable. And that was John Trudeau in 1992. What is mind control? We've heard it as brainwashing, love, coercive persuasion, thought reform. There's a lot of different words for it, but the legal term is undue influence. And it's any form of persuasion that so heavily influences you that you don't act or can't act in ways you otherwise may choose differently if it were not for the presence of that said persuasion. And in US law, excessive persuasion is that causes another person to act or refrain from acting by overcoming that person's free will and results in inequity. To Indigenous peoples from around this continent and beyond, the behaviors of authoritarian Bible cults or sects that colonize and then colonizer governments for the past 500 plus years is at work. And I am utterly convinced there's overwhelming evidence that my work of the last 45 years fits completely and will help, I believe, everybody to wake up. And I literally tell my clients that I counsel, the way to recover from unethical mind control is to control your own mind. and to know your authentic identity, and to have an internal locus of control, and to understand the differences between ethical influence and unethical influence. So that's what we're going to cover today in the next 15 minutes, if I can keep talking quickly, but still be understood. So this top piece is huge because most people have this myth. Oh, it happens to weak people, happens to other people. It could never happen to me. I'm too smart. I'm too educated. Get over it. We're human beings. We are designed to learn and adapt to our environments and people in our environments and to authority figures we perceive to be legitimate. That's just how the mind works. So everybody's vulnerable to a way of getting hacked. So be humble and learn about all the psychological warfare techniques that I'm going to try to touch on today. Being unduly influenced or experiencing mind control is not as obvious as we think, or we think it used to be worse. But when you're under undue influence, you think you're making your own free choice and able to see it clearly, but you're not thinking, and are indoctrinated and are living in a bubble of indoctrination unbeknownst to us. And we're often taught to ignore any dissonant information, critics, former members, as not legitimate. So this is a very important point in all of my work, and that is the word brainwashing was actually coined by a CIA operative to describe Chinese communist thought reform, something that Robert J. Lifton called thought reform. But it uses the wrong metaphor of a blackboard that has writing on it, which are our beliefs, and a sponge, a wet sponge that wipes it clean, and then you put new words on it and new beliefs. That's not what happens. It's much more like a dissociative disorder, and it doesn't erase your authentic identity. And I truly believe, I believe in God, I believe in spirituality. I believe we're born with a divine spirit, an essence, even if you don't identify with any religion. And this new identity is created that suppresses our real, authentic identity. And in my work, typically with religious cults, political cults, therapy cults, commercial cults like trafficking, it's the family and friends that typically identify. They've changed, and they can't even explain why they are now believing completely opposite things. And when I try to talk with them, it's like they've been invaded by the body snatchers, is typically what I hear from folks. There's in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, there's literally a category, a dissociative disorder category, that talks about brainwashing, thought reform, coercive persuasion by cults and sects that presents a problem in identity and questioning of identity. And that I experienced dramatically, the real Stephen and the cult Stephen. And the Mooney Stephen suppressed my real self to the point where I didn't believe my parents were my real parents. Moon and his wife were my true parents, and they were my satanic parents, even though I grew up Jewish and not believing in Satan, period. Oh, there's another piece to this. Thanks, Des. Forced assimilation, residential schools, mass criminalization, and sexual abuse. I'm trying to figure out what to do with the videos of everybody. Okay, let's move on. Mike, how am I doing for time? Trying to go fast. So the mind control tactics employed by authoritarian colonial regimes creates a sense of cultural insecurity because authoritarianism creates debilitating, insecure questioning and ongoing confusion, something critical to maintaining coercive control. And just to speak to what Cindy was saying earlier, it's so true. The mind controllers and mind control cults always project this belief, false belief, that the leader's perfect, the doctrine's perfect, and the policies are perfect. And if you have a problem, the problem is in you. So it's always turned around on you. What's the matter, Steve? You have trouble trusting? And as Cindy Blackstock so eloquently said, no, you're not trustworthy. That's why I don't trust you. That's the realization people need to get, that I know myself. I know my values. I trust my inner voice. And what you're telling me is BS, basically. And see also, am I indigenous enough? Asked by indigenous diaspora members. And these are some quotes that people often are heard saying. And again, thanks to Desiree for this. This system is confusing. Am I just stupid, or what is it about me that makes this so difficult to succeed within? Or I keep doing the same thing over and over, but get nowhere. What am I not changing about myself fast enough? Is it because I'm not good enough? Or this treatment doesn't feel right, and I know I should speak up, but I'll be hurt if I do so. And maybe it's just me being a coward. Or I'm not fitting in, and I guess it's just that I'm not smart enough, or I don't deserve acceptance. I had the same thought in the first Mooney workshop. Why is everybody taking notes like their lives depend on it? And it seems childish and simplistic to me, what they're presenting. But after 3 days of that environment, I questioned my own evaluation that this doesn't make sense out here, because they got into my head. So mind control, I need to minimize that. Great. Mind control and undue influence are sometimes able to severely limit Indigenous people's ability to feel cultural confidence due to ongoing insecure questioning around authentic identity and confused around decision-making power as a subsequent result. And I need to go forward. How do we do that? There we go. So what do people need to know to disrupt colonial thought control patterns? 1, destructive cults are authoritarian with pyramid structure using undue influence to assert control or advantage. 2, many colonial mass governance formations are authoritarian with a pyramid structure using undue influence to assert control or advantage. 3, understanding destructive cults helps us discern and identify hidden features of colonialism using mind control tactics. 4, the BITE model, which is present in a minute, behavior, information, thought, and emotional control model, and how fundamental attribution error and colonialism interplay, which I'll explain in a minute. Also, what the generations or gradients of warfare could mean to the 7 generations ahead. So the 3 stages that this was Kurt Lewin's work, and I first learned about it in a book called Course of Persuasion by Edgar Schein about Chinese communist brainwashing, published in 1961, was this unfreezing, changing, refreezing model. Because if you want to change someone's beliefs and identity, first you need to disorient and confuse them. You can overload them, which is the typical technique, or deprive them of senses and information. But most mind control cults overload, and you can't think analytically because you're getting a fire hose of information, and usually propaganda. Psychological manipulation, hypnosis, which is something that I'm extensively trained in since 1980. Altering states of consciousness so it bypasses your critical analytic mind, getting people to question their identity. And in some cults, they use drugs and alcohol. I believe Indigenous people are way too much self-medicating to deal with the trauma that they've been subjected to. And so disorient the person, then you start indoctrinating. And in Lewin's paradigm, it's changing is the term. And it's done in a very incremental, step-by-step way. And it's a lot of behavior modification techniques. There's modeling where you're paired up with a senior person who demonstrates the proper language and behavior, etc. A very important concept by my mentor, Robert J. Lifton, in his 8 criteria brainwashing in his landmark seminal book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism. He talks about one of the 8 criteria is mystical manipulation, where things happen and it's done in such a way that it appears to be mystical when in fact it's engineered intentionally by the controllers, by the predators. And that can include hypnosis and constant repetition of falsehoods, regressing the person to childhood so they don't have adult resources internally. And then the next stage is refreezing the new identity, right? So old identity is surrendered, new identity is reinforced, separated from the past, continuing indoctrination continues. The more you can give of your past over to them, the happier the controllers are. And they want to start getting you recruiting and doing stuff for them to internalize that cult identity. And thanks to Des, and Dr. Blackstock talked about Jerry Gamble in 1958 and what he wrote. And so she did a couple of slides that are wonderful. And I love the salmon. It's wonderful. So convince the Indian he should be patient. Convince or her or them. He should be patient, that these things take time. Tell him that we are making progress and that progress takes time. Make him believe that things are being done for his good. Tell him you're sure that after he has experienced your laws and actions, he'll realize how good they've been. Insist that the Indian go through proper channels, make the channels and procedures so difficult, he won't bother to do anything. And make the Indian believe that you're working hard for him, putting in much overtime and at a great sacrifice, and imply he should be appreciative. Stealing human rights when you obtain thanks from your victim. And that's Jerry Gamble, 1958, Steal Indian Rights as presentation at Tobique. If I'm pronouncing that incorrectly, I ask your indulgence, First Nation. And here's where the Lewin model fits with the unfreezing, disorientation, confusion, confuse the Indian that they should be patient, etc. Changing, use of behavior mod techniques, right? Refreezing the old identity and changing. And for the purpose of time, I'll just move on, but you can look at this. We'll put up the PDF on the First Nations website. So the healthy First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and Native Americans, helping each other realize we're surviving immense undue influence is a big part of liberation out of colonial thought control patterns. Freezing, changing, refreezing for 500 plus years is understandably traumatic and disorienting, but fortunately it isn't permanent. And I want to emphasize this. I've worked with people who were born in mind control authoritarian cults and exited at 60s or 70s because they wanted to be free, even for their remaining years. It's a deep spiritual need, I believe, of humans. So I think we're starting up here. I'm a salmon. And I will always be a salmon. And authoritarianism, why am I not exactly like the other fish? What's wrong with me? In the confusion and questioning. I'm hurt when I say that I'm a salmon. More undue influence. I'm not a salmon, I'm just a fish. You know, internalized undue influence. I've never heard of a salmon. I am a fish. So I have an influence continuum, and we'll get to a slide in a minute, but think about healthy influence and unhealthy influence, ethical influence and authoritarian control. And First Nations approaches is a much more balanced approach. I'm a fan of the breath of life theory that Dr. Blackstock I read about in her doctoral dissertation, which I felt was magnificent. And she talks about cognitive, physical, emotional, and spiritual as major pieces. And inside the self and community, actualization role, identity, service, and esteem, food, water, safety, housing, safety and security, belonging, and spirituality, versus mind control authoritarian cults, where it's a pyramid. Most people are out here and have no idea what's going on up here and what the real agenda is. And the levels of control are more extreme the further in the pyramid you are. So this is Miwok Desiree Kane's transformation of my boring influence continuum for this presentation. And I just thematically talk about healthy self, unhealthy self, healthy leadership, unhealthy leadership, healthy communities and families, unhealthy, and healthy spiritual practices and unhealthy ones. And I'm nervous about time if I should read each one of these things, but I invite you to study this and realize once you have an influence continuum in your mind and are able to sort, this supports my authentic self. I'm allowed to question. I'm allowed to have humor and be creative and do things my own way. Unhealthy, conformity, fear, demand for obedience and conformity. You can flesh out things that are happening. Is this ethical or not ethical? Is this leader ethical? Is he willing to admit he makes mistakes, or does he say he knows more than anyone else and never admits he makes a mistake? Is he willing to respect boundaries, healthy boundaries, and not violate them and abuse people who are not in the same authority? And likewise, authoritarians, I'm going to get to a slide about the qualities of predators and authoritarians in a minute. But I really encourage people to study this model and apply it to my BITE model. So what do we mean about an authentic self? It means being your true self in companionship, feeling understood, being able to be honest, revealing your feelings, trusting and understanding others, versus playing the role of the regime, good little Mooney, good little indigenous person. You have to behave the way we tell you have to behave, etc. Expression of true self versus conformity, enjoyment and ownership of actions versus suppressing of your cult identity, resisting authority and standing up for yourself versus this disgust and self-blame and programming that you can never be happy if you deviate from what the authoritarians are telling you is reality. So when a person is under undue influence of alt-right political cults like QAnon, they're surrounded inside a rigid bubble with many influences, less able to leave on their own free will, because we are dependent on information. And if people are on cell phones or on platforms 24/7 with propagandistic authoritarian nonsense or crap or extreme things, you can't reality test. So this is similar to being born indigenous into a colonial society that refuses to recognize you unless you suppress and even eradicate you if you challenge their policy. This is a very important slide, especially when I'm doing preventive education programs or I'm training mental health professionals to help people. Oops, we have an I missing in narcissism. Forgive me, missed that one. But there's narcissism, and malignant narcissism is a term by Eric Fromm that talks about the psychopathological variation of narcissism. And the normal narcissism, it's on a continuum, grandiose self-centered behavior, fantasies of power, success, of attractiveness, need for praise and admiration, sense of entitlement. Very importantly, lack of empathy, an inability to step into another person's shoes and feel what they're feeling. To walk in someone else's moccasins is what's coming into my brain at the moment. But the malignant, the psychopathological stuff is antisocial, like thinking you're above the law. No problem. Let's break the law. Let pathological lying, exploiting everyone for what works for you and your needs, sadism, harassment and silencing, violence or threats of violence, paranoia, and inability to trust. How am I doing for time?
You're out of time, but what about you take one more minute? And if you have some other stuff, we'll get to it in the Q&A. We want to.
Great. And I apologize.
Okay, no worries.
45 years of my life work, but I don't know. I'm not even remembering what comes next, but the slides are fundamental attribution area. Yeah, there's so much here. We are in an age of undue influence where we used to worry about nuclear bombs. Now we're in psychological warfare on the internet with very advanced AI that's deliberately polarizing and undermining people with customized information stolen from people to manipulate them. And that's the world we're living in. And the only solution, as I see it, is to learn about undue influence and all these techniques that are being used so you can identify it. And a former FBI agent said, name it and claim it in terms of undue influence things. If you can identify it, then its power over you gets diminished dramatically. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Steve. That was great. Obviously, we need a few more of these to get to more of your work. Thank you, and we'll come back with the Q&A after. I'd like to introduce now Dr. Pamela Palmeter, who is a Mi'kmaq citizen and member of the Eel River Bar First Nation in northern New Brunswick. And Pam comes from a large family of 8 sisters and 3 brothers. She's a lawyer and professor and chair in Indigenous governance at Ryerson University with expertise in Indigenous law, sovereignty, and nation building. She has over 30 years of experience studying, volunteering, and working in social, political, and legal issues affecting First Nations, and is a total powerhouse in Indigenous circles and non-Indigenous circles here in Canada. So welcome, Pam. Thank you for being here.
Well, thanks so much. And thanks for the introduction. Honestly, this is so awesome being part of this panel. I'm coming to you today from the sovereign territories of Mississaugas of Scugog, but the opportunity to work with Dr. Cindy again is just, I would never turn that down. And then when she said, oh, you've got to learn from this amazing person, Dr. Hassan, and I just thought, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. I want to learn. So today's panel is also about learning about some of the similarities and how you can apply these things. So thank you to everyone for putting this together. And I think it's important when you said at the outset, we're not talking about a specific cult here in Canada. We're not talking about the latest conspiracy theories. What we're doing here is taking a deep dive into how one of the worst and longest running genocides can continue unabated in Canada, like you can report the weather. You can literally just say, oh, look at these horrific atrocities. And now to the weather, as if it's just nothing. And so for me, because I do a lot of research on like the political side of things, state oppression and propaganda, I see a lot about how this conversation really is about how state propaganda, political rhetoric, corporate mantras, white supremacy, and anti-First Nation racism really all converge in this weird spot, which serves to direct, influence, sway, convince, manipulate, orchestrate, and design not just laws, policies, and practices that are anti-Indigenous, but also create and reinforce and sustain and maintain societal beliefs, inappropriate, abusive relationships, misunderstandings, corrupted values and norms that just perpetuate racism indirectly and directly, knowingly, and sometimes literally unknowingly to the people who are doing it. And they do it in ways that perpetuate grave human rights violations, violence, exploitation, oppression, dispossession, suffering, like great suffering, and even death. And these things are somehow normalized, defended, justified, or they're downplayed, minimized, deferred, studied, or ultimately ignored. And worse, the ways in which First Nations have been blamed for the devastating outcomes of centuries of exploitation of Indigenous lands and bodies is the biggest abuse here, because then that becomes internalized and we blame ourselves, and you see our little children committing suicide because they don't think they're worthy to live on this planet, which is literally the polar opposite of what our ancestors have taught us, that we are also very special and unique and we have a purpose here. And it is so frustrating to think that governments and corporations and society can have that kind of power over the smallest of our people, and that it's been going on for generations. And then when you see in the media an Indigenous person say something just so horrendous, and you think, but you're Indigenous. How could you think that way? And to know that they really believe that. They really believe that it doesn't matter how many women are raped or murdered or go missing, that what matters is if you get a good paying job on the pipeline and, the job is worth it. That we can actually make these kind of mental gymnastics to get around to what we know in our hearts is horrendous and atrocious, but to get to a place where it's somehow justified, or it doesn't concern me, it's them, it's othered. It's not within the sphere of what I should be concerned about. And so, given that our country has been founded on genocide and people know it, you would never know it in Canada the way people reacted to the findings of the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing. All of a sudden, you had these media commentators and political analysts saying, what? Genocide? What? That's incredible. It can't be genocide. It literally can be anything else, all of our own doing, but it can't be genocide. Never mind, they never even looked up the definition of genocide. They don't know the law. They never studied it. They didn't even take a look at the convention. It's just that ultimate reaction, which doesn't come from analytical or critical thinking. That's a deep-seated, well-ingrained emotive response that comes from the ways that Canadians have been educated and miseducated about what's okay and what's not okay in this country. And so you have a scenario where it's almost like they didn't know anything that happened to First Nations. But when you look at the data, every single survey that's been done on a nationwide basis here in Canada shows the majority of Canadians well know, in fact, atrocities that happen in residential schools. They do know about murdered and missing. They do know about the lack of water. They do know about the suffering. They do know about the suicides. And then you're thinking, okay, what is this disconnect? How can you see this and say, well, that's not a problem? And so I really feel Cindy when she says, I don't get it. Here's all the evidence. And we're on this treadmill, and I am too, constantly. I need another report. I need statistics. I need data, and say, see how bad it is? See how bad it is? And they're like, that's not bad. Remember how we gave you funding for this program last year? What's wrong with you? You're not being grateful. And so how do we get to this disconnect? How are increasing levels of poverty, lack of water and housing, high levels of chronic diseases, foster care apprehensions, incarceration rates continue to explode, human trafficking, murdered and missing Indigenous women, killings of Indigenous peoples by police, brutality? How is that not a national crisis? How is that not on the news every day saying, here's what we're doing. We've brought every resource to bear to bring this to an end. How is it that instead what we see on TV are heavily armed RCMP officers invading Indigenous lands with armored vehicles, helicopters, attack dogs, guns, and snipers live for everyone to watch, for unarmed, peaceful land defenders literally just trying to protect their water so they have something to drink? We're really disconnected. Like, Canadians are so disconnected from the reality. Yet we do have people who see. So Indigenous people see, advocates see. You have the United Nations human rights treaty bodies, and pick any one of them. The Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the Rights of the Child, CEDAW, the Human Rights Committee, special rapporteurs have all identified, documented, and called on Canada and said, listen, you are engaged in grave human rights violations against all of these conventions. You need to stop. And you need to take steps to make sure it doesn't happen in the future. And you need to make reparations from what you've done in the past. Canada doesn't do it. Canada just goes there and has the face to say, well, we're talking to Indigenous peoples and, all is good. Recently, CERD, the United Nations Committee for Elimination of Racial Discrimination, told Canada, remove the RCMP from Indigenous territories, remove those weapons, and make sure you protect them from police violence. They didn't do that. They've been called on to address the foster care crisis, murdered and missing, everything you can imagine. But Canada drags its feet because it can. It has set up a society where we're not going to be alarmed by this, that even the most obvious and atrocious lawlessness and mass human rights violations by the state, law enforcement, the extractive industry, which would never be tolerated in any other country. Canada would be pointing fingers. It would never be tolerated in cities against non-Indigenous peoples like Toronto, Fredericton, Montreal, can be justified, ignored, minimized, or in fact, just blamed on First Nations. And victim blaming, like the gaslighting that women often get from men, victim blaming that First Nations get, is really about deflecting accountability and turning it back on the victim, convincing them there has got to be something wrong with you. Stop holding on to your primitive culture. If you would just give up and integrate into society, everything would be good. The problem is with you. It's not with us killing you and incarcerating you and stealing your children. We wouldn't do that if you would just stop being the problem that you are. And the sad part about it, the worst part about it, is sometimes our people believe that, and not even consciously, but unconsciously. And then they start looking at other First Nations people and judging them like there's something wrong with them. Why don't you just pick up your socks? Why don't you just, behave like everyone else? Just go get a job. And so it's become so ingrained that even the best intentioned, well-intentioned people, investigators, advocates, lawyers, will make recommendations in reports that maybe this organization should engage in cultural awareness training, as if the problem is our culture. But the problem has never been our culture. The problem is the white superiority that is fed by wealth extraction and the desire for power over territory and other people. Because think about it. How many times have we heard, with regards to the raging poverty in First Nations, they just need to pick up their socks? Well, there's no clean drinking water here. Well, they just need to move. What's wrong with them? Murdered and missing. The violence? Oh, that's only just coming from Native men. Incarceration. Well, I guess you shouldn't be committing crimes. Beatings or killings by police. Guess you shouldn't be resisting arrest. Foster care. Well, you don't know how to care for your own kids. What do you expect to happen? Residential school graves. Well, it's not like they're mass graves. Residential school deaths. Well, everybody had TB back then. You can't blame the state for that. And on and on and on it goes. Clear cutting, mining, pipelines. Well, we need jobs. You complain you don't have any money. Don't you want a job? First Nations saying no to pipelines. Well, you don't have a veto. You only have the right to say yes. You don't have the right to say no to anything. Anything, not the abuse, not the destruction, not laws, you have no right to say no to anything. We don't have the right to say no. And police officers sexually assaulting Indigenous women and girls all across the country? Well, you can't hold them to account. I mean, there's few bad apples everywhere. Canada doesn't act with urgency on this because it doesn't have to. Societal attitudes, though somewhat changing in some sectors, insulate state atrocities. The state doesn't have to defend itself. Society will do that for the state by not acting, by looking the other way, by being willfully blind or simply not caring. We have been told, educated, and reinforced in laws, policies, practices, in the media and entertainment that we are savages, we're heathens, and we need to be saved by Europeans, that we're primitive and backwards and we need to be civilized, that we're dangerous and violent, and that means we need to be identified, cataloged, surveilled, monitored, tracked, and controlled. Oh, and the more recent ones were insurgents, rogues, threats, terrorists. So we need a whole law enforcement mechanism to maintain the suppression. So that brings us into the present. It's no longer about historic genocides and abuses. We have to continue to find reasons to suppress and control Indigenous peoples and even turn their own people against each other and think anyone who tries to break out of that, who tries to resist, well, they're a problem. They're a rogue. They're a militant. They're offside. They're not part of our nation. That's not how our nation is. And Indigenous women in particular are constantly portrayed as less worthy, exploitable, expendable, and that state and societal sexualized violence is sometimes her fault. This belief that has been perpetuated in society that we lack capacity is how the government maintains control over us in a wide variety of ways, but including in the Indian Act and stealing our children. The media headlines portray us, even if we've suffered the gravest violence, even death, we're still portrayed in these headlines or bylines as criminals, undeserved because we're addicts or sex workers or single moms or unemployed or we had previous convictions. And instead of showing a really beautiful picture of the woman that we lost, you'll see a mugshot from sometime she was pulled over by the police. That gives society the excuse and the license to say, oh, they are not worthy. And the worst sort of propaganda that really gets ingrained in our communities as well as in society is this idea of good Indians versus bad Indians. Good Indians work full-time, make good money. They chase the life of the house and the car and the vacation. They might be a CEO in an oil and gas company. They might be a police officer, live in urban areas and go golfing and have fun. Good Indians speak out against the bad Indians because those bad Indians threaten that scenario. Bad Indians are those that speak out against injustices, that potentially rock the boat, that land defenders, human rights advocates, women, children, in fact, they represent a threat to this propaganda that is this colonization of our minds. We talk about decolonization, and sometimes I wonder if even I fully understand what's exactly involved in identifying the colonizer in our mind and getting rid of it. And then remembering what's there, that we're there. We're always there. Our ancestors are teaching all of those great values. And so this has been going on for literally generations. And I'm going to show you just very quickly, because I know we want to get to questions. But this has been going on for generations. Look at what was in the Declaration of Independence. Wonderful words about inalienable rights, equality amongst men, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Oh, but keep reading. Except for the merciless Indian savages whose known rule of warfare is undistinguished. Basically, we're a threat to all age groups, all sexes, and all conditions of people. How many times have kids in the United States learned this and recited this and acted it out? And then all of our laws are based on that. Here in Canada, right now, how are we looked at? Well, this is all taken from state documents. So this could be from the RCMP, this could be from CSIS, this could be from the Department of National Defense. We are described as, and also in public, as rogues, violent, radicals, militants, eco-terrorists, insurgents, criminals, and threats to national security. The Minister of Indian Affairs stood up in Parliament and said, We are threats to national security. So this is a way of really trying to isolate and vilify anyone who speaks out outside of this propaganda, this colonized thinking that we have. And people who are not violent, who engage in human rights activism, can be called bad Indian. I mean, think of how long that would stay in someone's mind, right? Pam Palmeter, Mi'kmaq lawyer talking about Indigenous rights. But what you get from that, this subliminal messaging is bad Indian, don't listen to her. And worse than that, you know what? She's actually pretty dangerous, so be careful. You don't want to get subsumed by Palmeter's dangerous agenda. And worse, if that doesn't work, then give her the award of top 5 to fear in Canada. Never mind. No criminal charges ever, never been arrested, not detained. I am a lawyer, human rights champion. And so think about what that is doing, pitting us versus them. It's really incredible to think that that's how powerful all of this mind control stuff can work. And so I guess I just want to end with saying that in every way, Canada has used mind control techniques, physical and psychological isolation. So think about reserves, not allowing people to live reserves, residential schools, incarcerations, Indian hospitals. The criticism that comes through mind control that feeds on our fear of rejection, our fear of not being included in the community, this good Indian, bad Indian, this us versus them mentality that's based in superiority, control, and domination. Think about every law enforcement agency in this country versus the Indians. It's always like, cowboys versus Indians. And then there's this like social proof concept where literally all anyone has to do, any minister or politician has to do is say, well, look, this can't be racism. Everybody does this. Everybody thinks it's this way. So you're gaslit when you think, wait, I don't think this is right. You're shown, well, everybody does it, so it's got to be right. It's like this mutually reinforcing colonization of your mind that it's almost impossible to get over. And because it's so repetitive, because you do it over and over and over and over again, centuries of abuse, we can even adopt it. And then finally, when you are impoverished and you don't have access to water or clean housing, or you're not safe, or your children are taken away, or you're being threatened with incarceration, there's a certain level of physical, psychological, emotional fatigue can literally wear us down and make assimilation look like the only option. And so I say we need to uneducate, re-educate, decolonize our minds, think critically, embrace the people in our communities who are saying, I don't think this is right. We don't have to agree on everything, but embrace people who are speaking out. And we need full access to free, open, transparent, fact-based information. We need to hold governments and industries to account. And we need to look at ways in which we can identify all of the ways in which all of this racism and violence has been so ingrained that people don't even see it anymore. So that when we move forward, it's on a path of truth, fact, knowledge, and mutual health, safety, and well-being for everyone. We do it in a safe way. So, I'm open to skill testing questions, and I'm sorry if I took a little bit too long there.
You totally didn't, Pam. Thank you so much. So many powerful words, right? And so much response to that in the chat as well. It's really resonating with people, and so many true words. What a great combination of speakers. I'd like to, first of all, we have a couple of questions from attendees, but I just want to invite Cindy and Stephen to sort of respond to your talk, or ask an initial question to each other. If I think that will be productive. We have about 13 minutes left, and if we spend about 7 minutes on that, we'll have some time for the audience questions. Thank you.
All right, so I got one for Stephen, and that a lot of the research on mind control is focused on individuals. But we're seeing now that really this is about mind control of societies. And certainly in the colonial situation, that's what's that mind control not only happened in societies, but it's been passed down generation after generation. Are the strategies to disrupt the mind control for individuals the same as for this type of scenario with societal interventions? Or are there some that are different? And if so, what are the most effective ways of doing it on the societal scale?
Wow. Awesome. Cindy, Pam, awesome. Very briefly, and I did want to ask Desiree if she wanted to add a comment or something before we close. My way of thinking, and I know, Cindy, we've talked about complex systems and how there are bottom-down authoritarian systems, but the really healthy ones are the bottom-up systems where we think about multiple places to intervene. And we need to think from a public health perspective on preventive education, intervention by mental health professionals and others, and recovery. And we need to think about how to do a short-term plan, like then a 3-year, a 5-year, a 10-year plan, because it's going to take time ultimately to change the consciousness of the world on this. And what we see in the world is authoritarians, especially the oil countries and the Kochs and the libertarians, they want to make people so conditioned to helplessness, learned helplessness, that people will give over their power to some authority figure that says, I know the best approach. And but the solution, in my opinion, the big one is changing the law itself. Like literally making it a crime to enslave another human being. We have international laws about trafficking, and part of my doctoral dissertation was taking fraud, force, and coercion. And I've already done a training for the US government trafficking about applying my BITE model of mind control and the influence continuum to trafficking. And we need to think about precedent-setting cases we can lodge to really make it clear. This is not a murky thing. This is known science, social psychology. And with the internet, we have bad actors on the internet doing all kinds of very destructive things to people. And part of the cure is spending less time online, more time human to human, and that warmth connection.
And one of the things I'd say has been helpful for me is just looking at that influence continuum and sometimes pausing and thinking about where I'm at on this. And pausing the normal behaviors, thinking about when I'm in a reflex moment, why did I just do that without even thinking about it, right? And when I think that there's only a few choices to resolve a problem, that's when I think that mind control is really there. Like I'm normally a pretty kind of crazy creative person. So I'll look at a whole pile of ideas, but when I actually just either reflex into something or I think there's only one or two choices, like if my word and I reduce people's identity to being you're a Democrat or you're a Republican, you're First Nations or you're not, that's when I know that mind control stuff is partially there because I've dehumanized people through that. So I'll just leave that at that.
And we want to hear from Pam, but can I ask Des if you have a comment that you wanted to say, and if you want to pass, I would love to hear from Pam too.
Certainly, I want to take the opportunity to have a fan moment of Pam and Cindy. This was an amazing panel. I'm totally humbled that was even on this stage. Anyways, my question, so what we've heard across the whole panel is we know that there is control and undue influence happening. Native folks, I feel like we have the language because we're like, oh yeah, that story about Thanksgiving, we can identify super easily what's fake news because we're confronted with it constantly. So my question is what are some of the skill sets that exist within the communities? I look to our capacities for storytelling and longevity to help us reality test. What is the long-term Native stories oral stories wind up coming true or being verified hundreds of years later, etc. When we know this is going on, we know that it's a form of warfare. We know we have capacities for strong storytelling. What does anybody on the panel see as like a tool that we can use beyond just flooding the messaging systems with pro-Indigenous or Indigenous sovereign content, right? Like, what are other tools that we have? It's a little bit of a hard question, but we have skills. We have capacities. We're definitely brilliant. So like, what are some of those things that we can identify? I mean, that's a rhetorical question. But
I want to just quickly respond and say the way I see it as a system of the influencees, Indigenous folks who have been victimized, and the predators and the malignant narcissists and the big corporations and the governments exploiting land and resources, right? And we need approaches to empower Indigenous people, and we need resources to strategically influence the influencers, which might include, exposing that what they're doing, to their own families, to their own children. I think educating children of like the Kochs to what's going on, that their family has been perpetuating for decades. There are strategic things that I have thoughts about, but I'd love to hear from Pam because I talked twice. So I apologize.
No, it's all good. I'm just like literally sitting here taking notes. So for me, I don't think I have any like one solution or one tool. The way I see it is that, because Cindy just made me think about, this concept of balance. So, we have different conversations with the public than we have with our own communities. And I think that's necessary because the public's not always a safe place to have some really personal and heartfelt conversations. And we don't have to convince our communities that there's issues here. And so the way I see it is, for all the work we do, we have to be balanced in the sense of there's a lot of external work we need to do, but we can't also forget about the internal work and the attention that has to go to us meeting amongst ourselves and saying, what's working for us, what isn't working for us, doing the check-in, doing the ceremonies and the healing and stuff, and not just get so caught up with the external. And so in the same vein I'm wearing my resistance t-shirt because my focus has always been on resistance. But, in more recent years, it's like, but we have to also find balance and focus on the resurgence. Because, once you decolonize and get the colonizer out of your head, what's the space? What do we occupy that space with? And it could be relearning our languages. It could be appreciating our traditions, modernizing our laws into a current context. Like there's just so much to be doing and to give ourselves a break that we can't do it all. So the one who's out there defending the lands shouldn't also be tasked with the burden of reinstituting the language or doing the human rights advocacy. That we all have a different role to play. So balance doesn't have to be we're doing it all in equal proportions. It can be, well, Cindy's doing this. Oh, thank goodness. So I can do this. And oh, thank goodness. So that elder can just focus on language. And it's just about making sure that within our wider collective, we're well balanced with what we're doing. And Canada seeks to get us off balance all the time, off balance in nature, off balance in, individual versus community and family obligations and all those things. And we just got to work really hard against that, because I think there is healing in balance and there's decolonization in balance. And just to speak to your comment, Desiree, storytelling, I think it's important. Truth telling is important. Who's doing it? And to understand that we're all impacted. So not to say all elders have the answer, because some elders are very much suffering and they themselves don't have the answer because they are struggling with years of all of this too. Or, all women have the answer, or all we can't be so fundamentalist about it. We have to understand that we're all struggling with this decolonization and mind control stuff. And so let's just find the commonalities, recognizing that there could be hidden dangers in all of these things that we haven't yet addressed, and get all of that out of there.
And I would just add I just have a bunch of quick things for myself. That reflex thing is something I talked about, but words that we automatically think are benevolent and that we understand, like self-determination. I actually said to you earlier, I actually think self-determination begins with declaring yourself free. And I've never been comfortable with the word decolonization, because that puts colonization at the center of it instead of you and who you are and where you come from at the center of it. I think you have to get that first before you can go after that decolonization piece. So look at these words that we automatically assume that are benevolent, that self-determination is going to fix everything. Like, that's a very naive kind of point of view. We all know that when we actually look at that, but somehow it's often marketed and we believe it. We don't actually describe what it looks like. We have to look at words like even the healing piece. I've had talks about this before. I don't use that word because it means recovery from illness. Why don't we use the word we're building on multi-generational strength? Why do we say that we're healing? I think that that's an important, where are the non-Indigenous folks? Why aren't they healing? They've been doing all the wrongdoing, the ones in government. And then the piece I would add to your around the Indigenous and government and corporations is the public. Like, to me, they're the deal breaker. And that's where we really have to convert this mind control. What I would love to do is, I'm hoping all of you enjoyed it. And I'm hoping you're going to put in in the chat whether you'd like us to continue this conversation in public, because it's something that we're learning and we'd like to bring other people into this conversation, but we think understanding mind control is really important. I'd really commend to you to do what I've been doing, which is reading some of Dr. Hassan's books, reading Pam's work, seeing how things are moving together, and then adding to this conversation, because I just think this is such an important topic that we've never really looked at colonialism from this particular point of view, with the deliberate time that it takes to really set ourselves free. And thank you, Melisa, for all your amazing work organizing it, and Desiree for all of your fabulous mentorship as we've gone on this journey.
Well, thank you, Pam and Stephen and Cindy, for your amazing work. It looks like people really would like us to organize more talks on this. I'm really sorry to those who asked questions that we didn't get to those. The question about the media, I'd say watch Pam Palmeter's webcast.
Oh, the Warrior Life podcast?
Yeah, the Warrior Life podcast. That is intervening in media in a huge way, and way more people need to be seeing that. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us. We'll send out an email to all the attendees with links to the video recording of the event and the other pertinent links to the slides that you saw today. I really feel like this conversation has just started, so I would like to assure everyone we'll be keeping this work up.